Good evening, everyone. I'm the last man standing between us and dinner, so I'll finish it fairly quickly. This is a continuation of what Anurag and Girish mentioned, particularly in the area of business SLAs. Fundamentally, for the last few years, in fact for the last decade or so, we keep hearing IT SLAs are green, but the business user is not happy, right? So the business SLA concept is essentially a double click of the same and trying to figure out how we do it and how do we make a business user happy and at the same time related to the IT SLAs. Now there are certain critical success factors which I think as an organization, as a service provider, as well as a customer, we need to take care of to ensure that business SLA management is put into practice and put into practice well. So fundamentally, these are the typical complaints you hear. IT is talking about bits and bytes, the business is talking about budgets and revenues, right? Then the IT is talking about reports. Again, the business is saying that I'm not happy with the reports, so on and so forth. So there are mismatched expectations all across. So how do we look at it? What does the business want? The business essentially wants service level reporting, right? If I'm a business, of course, the key here is definition of a business itself, because that itself is a critical parameter. How do you define a business, right? Is HR department a business? It probably is, because if it's a function and you want to look at an SLA across a function, that could be a business SLA as well. So how do you define a business is one of the critical aspects. Now, from a business perspective, what does one want to see? One wants to see what is the availability of IT or what is the availability of an IT system to meet the end user, be it my own end users or my customers' end users, right? So that is what business wants to see. Now, from an IT perspective, what we would do is essentially break it down into IT parameters, because at the end of the day, it is important for us to measure IT parameters as well. I mean, you can't do away with that. But how do you link all of this to make it a business SLA is the challenge. So the IT breakdown, right, has to logically group into a business breakdown and hence you deliver that business SLA. Now, from a business perspective, as I said, all that the business is interested is the client, right? Be it the end user client or be it a user in a bank branch, or be it a teller, be it a retail customer who's doing online banking, it's any one of these folks. The IT is linked with the rest. So the rest is the IT's problem. How we link these two is where the challenge lies. So as I said, the first point is about how do you define a business service, right? So this definition of a business service, with an example, we take a loan request, right? A loan request is a requirement from a business. It has certain end user transactions, right? So there are experiences across these end user transactions. For example, there is an entry of a request, there is an assessment, and finally there is a loan acceptance. So keeping this in mind, how do you define this, right? What is the underlying IT behind each one of these transactions? So we take a business transaction, we take a business service, break it down into its underlying transactions. Now break that down into its IT interactions, which is basically, what are the IT services that run behind it, and then break that further down into data, right? So how quickly is my data fetched? What is my transaction response time? What is the end user response time, and so on. So fundamentally, when one looks at business service SLAs, one has to break it down into these four layers. One is definition of what a business service is. Second, breaking it down into its components from an application perspective. Then breaking it down into its, all the web components, the infrastructure components, etc., etc. And lastly, the data stores and the databases. So fundamentally, if we look at a business service, this is the map that we need to get right. And this is not a static map, which is the other challenge that one has in a business environment, right? These maps are very, very dynamic. For example, a change request where one changes a server or virtualizes a server completely changes this map, because you need to get the underlying map all over again, right? So that requires a lot of process rigor. That's a critical success factor when you look at a business service management implementation, right? This is more to do with how do you implement it and how do you sustain it. Because from a one-time perspective, it's very easy to say these are all the IT parameters. This is the business service. This is how I would implement it and get done with it, right? And then I start reporting on that basis. However, how do I sustain this? That's the critical challenge, which as a service provider, one has to take care of all the processes behind it and ensure that from a change management perspective, from a new IT infrastructure perspective, if there is an IT refresh, all of this, how does it fall back into this pack, right? That's the critical aspect of business service management. Now, when we look at an IT view of the same, it's a transformation of the same 4 steps or the 4 blocks into an IT view. Now, in the IT view, from a business service management, the way we define it, we also include the end user clients, we also include the end user network, the LAN, WAN, etc. The entire thing is mapped. What I'm showing you here is essentially a live example of a business SLA map, right? So this is what we typically use to map the underlying components and get the overall business service measured. Now, critical success factors to delve upon these, some of these I've already touched upon. One is clear definition of what we want to measure. What is a business, right? What is a business service? So this definition is where we would probably spend some amount of time in understanding what is critical to be measured and acceptance of how it has to be measured, right? Whether it is a transaction response time, whether it is an end user availability of let's say a banking application on a teller machine in a particular branch at a particular time, is that the measurement? What is the measurement, right, that we are looking at? And most importantly, if this is the measurement, is today's underlying infrastructure and the application architecture capable of handling this requirement, right? That is also another key aspect that one has to take care of. Because it's very easy to say I want a transaction response time of 2 milliseconds. But is it going to happen, right? Or do I have to spend millions to be able to get that done? So these are the aspects that one defines when you look at business SLAs. The second is, as I said, process management. Here, to do it once is easy. To do it once is an exercise that can be easily done by us as well as the customers. But to sustain this, to make sure that every change request management goes through this, to make sure that every new infrastructure or new client that comes in is mapped to a particular business. That is where the challenge is. And as a rigor, as a process, it is important for these support teams and the IT management teams also to understand this and build this within their process management, right? So that's the key to keep it current, that's the key to keep it updated. Otherwise, this can become defunct very, very quickly. And lastly, integration of the IT landscape. So it also requires a single system of records, because if I want to measure business SLA management, I can't do it if I'm measuring servers with one application, if I'm measuring network with one other application, etc., etc. So I need to integrate the entire thing into a framework which is logical and which gives this cut right across the infrastructure and applications. So these are broadly the critical success factors that we would be looking at when we come and speak about business service management, and ensure that these are taken care of and there's a process rigor put in place to ensure that this is sustained, because at the end of the day, this is not a one-time exercise, but it will continue for years to come. So in summary, essentially, if we need to get this alignment and if we need to ensure that business SLAs are managed, number 1, definition, number 2, process management, and number 3, IT infrastructure mapping. So these are the 3 critical aspects which will ensure a successful business service management. So this is the CMS way, and this is what we're working on automating continuously and ensuring that we deliver this to our customers. Thank you.